The Battle of Britain is about to begin.
We got tanks up there. Let's follow a range on Detroit. I do have that on the target right now. I've got a couple right in front of me. I'm going after it. Right, I got him.
All right, we are back with episode 72 of the Lead Pursuit podcast, and it's been a while, but we are here today with myself, Steve, Brett. How's it going,
Hey.
Brett?
Hey, everybody. Doing good?
And the one and only Roger Gerrish. How's it going, Roger?
It's going all right. Thanks a lot, Steve. It's just, what is it? It's now just after 9 o'clock in the UK. So, yeah, very well. And thanks for inviting us on.
Yeah, and Roger's here for a special reason today, and we'll get into that. Kind of a weird feeling recording here when it's still sunny and daylight out, trying to link up with Roger. It's a little new here, foreign territories. But we'll see how this goes. And there's no Doug today, so this is kind of me and Brett again. And we will see what happens here. But today, we will be talking about the one and only Supermarine Spitfire. But before we get into that, let's just talk a little bit about what's going on in the hobby world. And, man, where you been, Brett? We haven't seen you in a while. What's been going on?
Man, I've taken a couple of 2-week vacations pretty much back to back for moving and then for just sanity reasons. So I feel like I've been gone forever, and I haven't done any hobby stuff because I've just been, moving in, unpacking, and that kind of thing. But steps in the right direction. I'm actually, I'm sitting right now, actually in my future hobby space. So that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I could say the same thing too. I haven't had a ton of time to do some hobby stuff. I've been plugging away a little bit of painting some bolt action, a little bit painting some B25s. But other than that, man, just wrapping up summer and kind of sucking the last little bit of nice weather we have in the Northeast here. And Roger, how about you? You been working on anything exciting?
I'm basically carrying on a 13-month obsession with 3D printing, I suppose. If anything came out of COVID-19 for me, it was lockdown meant I had to find some other things to do, and 3D printing sort of took off there. And well, as my wife says, I'm just obsessed, addicted. So I've got stuff running upstairs. I may disappear halfway through this just to check if something's printed okay. So yeah, so that's me at the moment. More and more resin.
See, I thought for sure, Roger, that's why you were on today, was to talk to us about printing, because anytime I see any post from you, it usually revolves around several hundred new prints you've just completed. And I think to myself, how in the hell are you going to get all that stuff painted? You're going to live forever if you keep making projects like that for yourself.
I'm never going to get it printed, so it probably will end up going out to to charitable organisations, or Martin, who is our UK excellent painter. So I'm sending some stuff across to him, and he will do a great deal of justice to those. I'm very happy showing printed models, but then when it comes to actually the painting part, that's where I get a little bit more nervous, because I'm getting on a bit now. My eyesight's nowhere near as good as it used to be, and my concentration isn't as good as it used to be. So the painting, I start off with great intentions, and then I just look at it and say, that's terrible. But yeah, I'm all right.
So speaking of COVID projects, man, Brett, I don't know. Why don't you make a nice little exciting announcement we have here coming up? Why don't you take it away?
Yeah, okay. So, besides, I know I've used my moving, 2-3 times now, whatever, as an excuse for not getting any hobby done. But a big part of not getting any games played has been the work we've been putting into the infamous campaign system. The time that we would otherwise get on Tabletop Simulator to play our games and that kind of thing, and maybe time that I would otherwise maybe spend in the evening painting, a lot of times has been dedicated to just nugging out details and stuff for that thing. And we had a long session last night, and we can say that we are likely one day away, one session away from full completion. There's very little left to do. We've done all the page numbering and all the silly final stuff like that. A lot of that was done last night. So very exciting. I'm super stoked to know that we are at the very final stages of having something that we can then figure out how to get into people's hands.
Yeah, I mean the race is on, right? We can't let the infamous Midway starter set beat the infamous campaign. So hopefully we'll wrap that up tonight, and then man, make it available, huh? It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's been now 14 months of really pretty constant effort. We've worked on that, I would say, once at least, if not 2-3 times a week for nearly 14 weeks, with very few breaks in that period. So it's been a lot of effort, and it's not just been you and me, of course. Roger knows this. Roger and Leslie and even others have had a lot to do to collaborate on that and help us get a final product done. So we're greatly in debt to the folks who helped us out, like Roger and Leslie, and for your effort to help us get this thing. And I'm so excited. I can't wait to actually start getting to play it again. So.
From being able to see it, I think it's a wonderful product, and I think it's going to go down really, really well. So it's fantastic to know that it's coming out so soon.
As proud as I was of that final, or whatever you call it, what do they call that second proof that you looked at, that hard copy proof copy? That as proud as I was of that and how much it evolved from our very first proof copy, that small changes we've made since that, I'm even, it's certainly still evolving. And now, the evolutions are just a little tidier. They're not as dramatic or anything like that, but just the organization and some other little things. I think I'm just real excited. I think it's going to be a good thing.
Yeah, it is exciting, and man, hopefully in a week or two, get some, limited edition signed copies out, really sought after to the people who helped, but it's on the way. Yeah, it's exciting. So upcoming event, the Texas Broadsides event at the Lone Star Flight Museum, the 22nd to 24th of October. That is the same weekend as Siege of Vicksburg. So Siege of Vicksburg, myself and Doug and some other Blood Red Skies people will be there. Texas Broadsides, if you're into Check Your Six or some of those other games, would be a great thing to check out. Sounds like a really cool event. A lot of the kind of Texas contingency will be there doing their Check Your Six things. And then Adepticon just dropped this week. That looks like Adepticon 2022 will be happening. So keep your ears and eyes open for any more announcements on Adepticon.
That should be late March, right? I think the dates I have are 25 to 29 March. And man, Steve, I think you got to go, man. Doug and I are, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. We're going. I'm sure he's going. I'm going to go. I think he should come. It's going to be amazing.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Maybe we got to get Leslie or Roger or some of those other guys over here too for Adepticon, huh? Easy flight into Chicago. You can get a flight from anywhere in the world into Chicago. Shouldn't be too hard for them to get here if they're out of lockdown by that point.
It would be excellent. I haven't been to the States for a couple of years, and we haven't even had the conventions properly starting up in the UK for such a long time. We're starting to see a few turning up soon. There's going to be a Warlord Open Day soon, and there'll be the Salute Show later on in the year. But really, it's been dead in the UK for so many months, and slowly but surely we're moving in that right direction. So coming across the States would be wonderful. It would be a really good thing, and I know there's several of us who just really love to do that.
So before we get into the meat of the episode here, I have to preface this, as we did with the 109 episode, that I have said numerous times that I am a big fan of History Light, right? So I like history. I love the machinery, and I love kind of the anecdotal stories that come out of history. But I am by no means a scholar or a student on the Spitfire. And in fact, I do have to kind of admit, when I got into Blood Red Skies, I kind of saw the starter set, and my immediate thought was, I'm going to buy some Corsairs, I'm going to buy some P-51s, and I just didn't like how they played. So I said, you know what, I'm going to check out these Spitfires, and I'm going to give it a go. And I would say in the last probably 2 years that I've had this game, I have learned more about the Spitfire and the Battle of Britain and just that sort of aspect of World War II than I even knew existed. So we have Roger here that is going to kind of jump in, but from my standpoint, I'd like to really kind of focus on how the Spitfire fits into Blood Red Skies and talk a little bit about the history, but see where we can go towards really how it plays in the game. So just, Roger, if I make any mistakes here, please feel free to tell me to shut up and correct me.
Yeah, you got to realise you're talking about an iconic thing. It's almost held in mythical status in Britain because of the Battle of Britain itself, and despite the fact that the Spitfire was not, probably didn't shoot down as many aircraft as say the Hurricane did or whatever, it's a national icon. So it means a lot. And when people talk about World War II here, more than often it's the Spitfire that comes to mind.
So just to give a little brief history of where we're coming from, just the notes that I found, just doing some minimal research. Looks like it was kind of conceived in 1934, and it was kind of a response to, they wanted to have a fighter that had 8 303 machine guns. And if I remember correctly, I think I remember hearing anecdotally that the shape of the wing, that iconic elliptical shape, actually came about just because of needing to fit those 8 303 machine guns into the wing itself.
Yeah, the 8 machine guns, to be fair, came out of the fact that there was very little confidence at the time that pilots would be able to hit their targets because aircraft were getting faster and faster, and during that period of time in the early 30s there was hardly any difference between the performance of a fighter as far as speed was concerned and a bomber. And the idea was that you would probably only get one pass because of that speed differential, and you needed to basically, they reckon you had 2 seconds of firing against a target. So 8 guns covering the largest amount of area, getting a hit, a 2-second shot, hopefully would be enough to kill a bomber. So yeah, that's where the eight guns came from, simply on the fact that it was felt that you needed to throw out as much firepower as possible to actually hit the target.
I was recently watching a pretty recent documentary made in England about the Spitfire, and there was some pretty cool things about the wing itself that they hit on about. I guess there was a huge team of designers at Supermarine, and one of them was a Canadian that somehow went to Germany and studied somewhere with some German engineers, and perhaps borrowed that elliptical, that sort of that iconic wing shape from a design concept that a German engineer had, and brought it back, and that is a big part of how that wing design, that shape anyway, came into play. I thought that was kind of an interesting insight.
As much as anything, it was the sort of the rapid development that took place in materials and manufacturing capability in the 20s and the 30s that that these sort of wings were seen as being ideal, but at the time they just couldn't see how to build those without all the bracing, without all the various other structural things. But these new cantilevered wing designs, at that point in the early 30s, they began to realize that they could actually turn those concepts into facts. Beforehand they couldn't do that, but now they could. And I think there was the elliptical wing idea, and well, many excellent aerodynamic wing ideas sort of came to fruition in the early 30s purely because of that technological advancement. You often hear some people saying, oh yeah, well, this was a direct development of the Supermarine S6 racing seaplanes that contested the Schneider trophies in the 20s. But in reality, that was probably as far from the truth as you can see, because if you look at the two aircraft themselves, the S6 did not have the elliptical wing. It had all the bracing and wires and the like. It was sleek, there's no doubt, but very little similarity between the two. And it's all one of those almost like urban myths has built up that the Spitfire developed from that. In fact, it developed from probably from a Supermarine model called the 224. In the early 30s, the Air Ministry put out a requirement to the various companies to build the fighter, the 8-gun, 4-gun fighter as it would have been then, but the sort of the ultimate fighter. And Supermarine actually brought out something called the 224, and it was a monoplane. It was gull winged and it had non-retractable undercarriage. But it was a failure in the end because the engine, the Kestrel, was a failure, and that killed a lot of prototypes. But it was actually called at the time the Spitfire. So there was a Spitfire back in the early 30s. It ended up actually on a shooting range somewhere to be destroyed. But in some respects, if you look at that Type 224, you can actually see where the development or the evolution into the Spitfire actually took place.
I always think that the Spitfire just, besides being such an iconic silhouette and everything, I think if you look at it, it just looks so sleek and I don't know the right word, sort of.
It looks modern, right? Like for the other planes at the time, it just looks very modern.
Yeah, it has an aesthetic that is pleasing in a way that, we talked about this a little bit on the last Spotlight episode about the BF-109. You look at a BF-109G, there's nothing like terribly sleek and animal-like, at least from I don't know, you know what I mean? Like the 109 is just kind of ugly looking in a brutal way, whereas the Spitfire is so sleek, and I can't think of the word, but it's going to come to me. It's very aesthetically pleasing in a very sort of streamlined way that it's sort of the opposite of a 109G in that regard.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a very like you said, it's just a very different design, whereas the 109 was kind of like all business. The Spitfire, you look at it and you're like, yeah, they put a little thought into how this was going to look, form and function rather than just function all the way.
Yeah, I guess a kind of elegance, and maybe that's the word I'm hunting for, sort of an aesthetic elegance besides just the functionality of the thing,
And I think that is one of those things that actually, again, why people sort of, hold it close to their hearts here. I mean, the look of the thing. And also, to tell you the truth, the sound of the thing, because the Merlin engine, and you'll hear that when you listen to Mustangs and the like. But there's a sound whenever we're here and you hear that sound, it's unmistakable, and it always gets you rushing to the window to have a look out and see if it's a Hurricane or a Spitfire. It's the sound of the Merlin 10, as they say. It's just wonderful.
So it was delivered to squadrons. The first delivery is in 1938. And when the Battle of Britain broke out, I guess it was because of the supercharger that it was pretty much tasked with those high altitude rolls of bomber intercept, which I guess would be a reason why the Hurricane certainly was responsible for downing more aircraft and more kills and such like that. But that elliptical wing they found was very optimal for kind of those high altitude intercept missions. Is that still going in the right direction there, Roger?
Yeah, and I mean, one of its major roles was to break up the escort fighters, whether they were sort of bouncing from high up or whether they were actually in close escort. It did tend to work out that that the Spitfire would generally be tasked in the anti-fighter role, thus leaving the Hurricanes well, the Hurricanes had plenty of run-ins with the 109s, but tried to concentrate the Hurricanes on the bombers. Because again, it's interesting because both aircraft were really designed as interceptors and as bomber interceptors, because again, it never ever really came into British thinking that the Germans would be able to roll over France, would be able to take down the Low Countries, and that you would actually have single-engined escorts, accompanying German bombers over Britain. It was just not even envisioned. So we were lucky that the Spitfire had that additional edge in performance that meant when we had to take on single-engine fighters coming over here, we actually had an aeroplane that was capable of doing that. If we'd say just had the Hurricanes, they would have done sterling well against the bombers, but probably not as effectively as against the 109s. So we were lucky in that respect. But yes, you're right that that additional performance hike that the Spitfire had and its streamlining, I think, lent itself to the anti-fighter aspect of the Battle of Britain.
Excellent. So, the real remarkable thing that I find about it, and this was the same with the 109 episode, in total, there were 22 variants made of this aircraft. So just like with the 109, where they kind of had that tried and true design, and they kept adapting it and modifying it. The Spitfire is very much the same, where a lot of the American planes, you don't see that. You might see 3 or 4 variants, and then they kind of take what they learn and they build a whole new airframe. 22 total variants with the Spitfire, a couple of naval variants, a photo recon variant. Now, I wanted to ask you, the Seafire, when I look at a Seafire, I can see a pretty visible difference with the naked eye. Does the Seafire fit in with those Spitfire variants, or does that start to kind of transition where there's kind of like a line there? Is that kind of its own aircraft?
The Spitfires just tended to be parallel versions of whatever happened to be the main land-based fighter at that time. So beyond elements of strengthening of certain areas of the aircraft, putting in sea survival gear, an arrestor hook, etc., the Seafires to a certain extent were very, very close to their land-based equivalents. The Seafire was never a great carrier aircraft in some respects, often simply because of the way its undercarriage was, because when it's undercarriage, it's not wide-spaced, it's very close together. And there's tons and tons of photographs of Seafires that have had landing accidents where the undercarriage couldn't take the hammer or the bang. So, once it got off the deck, it was great. But getting it back onto deck was a lot harder, and I think the Fleet Air Arm was very happy with when it was able to pick up American fighters like the Wildcat Martlet and eventually the Hellcat and of course the Corsair. So it was effective. It was an effective aeroplane as a carrier aircraft, but it was uncomfortable in that sort of position. But if you wanted a high performance fighter, then that was necessary, and the RAF the Royal Navy, the Fleet Air Arm needed high performance fighters because it was coming up against Zeros, Messerschmitts, other things that the earlier fighters just couldn't handle.
So 22 variants made, and service life. So the fighter variants, I found they were retired in the early 1950s. And this, again, really kind of parallels to the 109. It really fascinated me how long the longevity of that aircraft. But the Photo Recon Spitfire served all the way through until 1954, 1955. So when you start to get into the mid-50s, to have a plane of pre-World War II origin in that same arena, that's pretty impressive that those were still flying until the mid-1950s.
I think it was one of the things about the Spitfire was one of its strengths was the airframe had a lot of capacity for development from an engine perspective, from an aerodynamics perspective. You see later Spitfires with contra-rotating props, the bubble canopies, laminar, starting off with laminar wings. It had that ability which perhaps some of its contemporaries, some of its Second World War contemporaries, like the 109 or whatever, couldn't match. So it was, and it was widely exported after the war. Sort of everybody wanted a Spitfire, and so I can't remember how many operators there were of it. I think India were one of the last countries to actually stop using it. I think 1957 was when the Indians finally retired their last photo reconnaissance Spitfires, and I think its last air-to-air combat role was probably during the Arab-Israeli conflict in 1948, where you had a number of Spitfire engagements, because the Egyptians had Spitfires, the British who were there still had Spitfires, and the Israelis had Spitfires as well. And there was quite a number of dogfights between the various sides. So yeah, its longevity is very, very impressive. And there's quite a few of them still preserved and still flying examples. Not as many as we'd like there to be, but there's still a lot of them out there. So it certainly was an airplane that had a level of longevity. It could be taken to the next level, and that's probably a reason why you're seeing sort of 24 or 22, 24 marks of the thing, because that continual enhancement. I mean, some of the marks were just simply a different engine, or to show the fact that it was produced from a different sort of factory or something like that. But there was a heck of a progression.
Hey, Roger, I wanted to ask you, is that Merlin engine kind of synonymous with the Spitfire? I mean, I know a little bit about the Merlin, but I was thinking you could probably tell me a lot more.
Well, I mean, it was. It came out. There was. I think it was the Goshawk was the engine. I think that was originally going to be the fighter engine in the early 30s, and it proved to be a real failure because the cooling they couldn't keep it cool. And then at that time, Rolls-Royce had a fairly successful engine called the Kestrel, and that was then developed further. The whole ideas of superchargers and the like, and that became the Merlin. And the Merlin sort of became, well, there was plenty of other aircraft manufacturers. There was the Hercules engines, etc. But the Merlin is extremely famous because it was obviously the Spitfire's power plant, it was the Hurricane's power plant, it was the power plant of the of the Mosquito, of the Lancaster. So all the sort of the big players, the Merlin engine. I mean, again, you'll get a sort of jingoistic effect from our side. The engine that won the war, sort of thing. And of course, we always point to the fact that the very successful P-51 Mustang had a developed version, a license-built version of the Merlin as well in the Packard. So yeah, it's one of those things that I think it's you can't divorce the Spitfire from the Merlin in a way, because they are complementary, and I think one without the other wouldn't have been the Spitfire Merlin combination was sort of like a dream ticket.
Did early Spitfires have some kind of inversion problem where if they like a negative G loop or something, the engine might give you problems? What was that all about?
Yeah, well, it's mostly brought out in the Battle of Britain, where you get Messerschmitts, for instance, if they're getting into trouble, could generally get away from a Spitfire by sort of going inverted and diving away. And the Daimler-Benz engines, I think, were fuel injected, so they could handle those sort of manoeuvres with no issues at all. But the Merlin engine in both the Spitfire and the Hurricane, gravity carburetors, and once you went into negative G, that had a good chance of cutting off the flow of fuel to the engine, and that would cause a stall out. So it was one of those things that it was always a sort of a get out of jail card free for a Messerschmitt generally, that if it got into trouble, it could usually just roll away and dive, and get away, because the Spitfires and Hurricanes couldn't follow, because in all likelihood they'd be suffering from some sort of engine failure. But then then within a couple of years, the Merlin was fitted with a I don't want to say gravity resistant, but a carburettor that wasn't upset by negative G. So Spitfires could start then following fuel injected engined aircraft into those sort of negative G dives.
Is there any? So there's another thing I was thinking about with the Spitfire and I can't remember the term, but didn't they have a funny colloquial term for the control column, like what do they call it, beer handle or something like that? Are there like colloquial terms or slang terms or whatever for the Spitfire in different ways like that?
I think there probably are. To tell you the truth, I'm not too familiar with those aspects. I will try and find out what that was, but that one eludes me at the moment. I mean, there's a few interesting things that the Spitfire got involved in, sort of colloquially. I don't know if you've seen some of these pictures that you see of some Spitfire Mark 9s, which have got beer barrels on the bomb shackles, and this whole idea there was an express group of Spitfires that would bring beer from the UK into France after D-Day. And they'd fly at high altitude, and of course these beer barrels would be cooled by the high altitude, and they used to bring this beer across to the forces in France. I think it's a bit of a sort of propaganda type thing, but it's one of those little sort of anecdotal things that happened with the Spitfire. And one of the things just as interesting was that Spitfire as a name, Mitchell, who designed the Spitfire, hated it. Didn't like that name at all. And in fact, one of his ideas, what he wanted to call it, was the Supermarine Shrew, Shrew. The little rodent, little thing. So yeah, I'm trying to imagine how it would have been that you get Germans shouting "Achtung Shrew" rather than "Achtung Spitfire." It wouldn't have had quite the same ring to it.
That's funny. I'm always perplexed when I hear, fighter aircraft names like the Pea Shooter, or in this case, the Shrew. It doesn't sound really frightening. Aren't there some Australian aircraft that have funny names like that too? Like the Wallaby,
I think, right?
Yeah, something like that.
We're away.
Whatever.
Yeah, that doesn't sound terribly frightening. I think the Spitfire certainly sounds a little more intimidating than Shrew, but hey, that's interesting. That's a neat. Hey, we were on Happy Hour guess what was it, day before yesterday, and you held up a book and you claimed it to be the Bible for the Spitfire. What was that book, Roger?
I'd have to go upstairs to get it, because I had to come down because of a change of computers. But it's a 450-page. I think it's Spitfire: The Complete Story. I'll get you the details afterwards, so maybe you can just drop something, and when you put the podcast up, you could actually put up a reference to the book itself. But it is the Bible. It's about 450 pages worth of just total detailed information on the Spitfire, all the nuances of it. Each goes through each mark, all the various developments, the changes that took place, why they made those changes. It's a fantastic thing, and it's just an excellent 3-view colour drawings as well of multiple colour schemes in different nations and things like that. I'll get a hold of that, and I'll get you that, so you can put that information up. But anybody who really likes the Spitfire or really wants to know everything there is to know about Spitfire should get that book.
Awesome. Well, let's transition here to the Spitfire in game, and I'm hoping you could kind of make some sense of this for us, of where these different cards come from, why Andy chose these specific marks to make that a definitive new aircraft. But we'll start off with the first one, the Spitfire 1/2, and that's just the starter kit Spitfire, everybody's basic airplane. It's a speed 7, maneuverability 3, and a firepower of 1. So I don't know, Roger, that firepower of 1 for an airplane that was supposed to have 8 machine guns in the wing. What happened there?
Well, it was. I guess Andy initially determined three firepower levels. So that was going to be it. There wasn't going to be anything, and well, 4 if you count firepower 0. So he knew that he would have to be catering for beasts like the 262 with 430mm cannons, further up the range and the like, and multi-cannoned aircraft. So although 8 303s sounds, fairly effective, there's a lot of anecdotal and probably real information to show that when that those bullets, those 303s, even if you could deliver a fair few on target, were not really that capable of bringing down aircraft as effectively as, say, a cannon armament or even a heavy machine gun armament. So at that time, it was just determined that okay, we'll keep both, because they wanted to keep the 109 and the Spitfire reasonably balanced. So the feeling was that 2 20mm cannons, 2 machine guns in the MA 109 versus 8 303s. They'll be balanced out. We were looking at firepower factor 2 for things that had like 4 cannons, 4 20mm cannons or something like that. So we just decided at that point to say, well, okay, let's fix it at 1. And we know people will either agree or disagree or whatever, but we had to sort of put a line in the sand at some point, and that's what we said. So okay, these first 2 fighters, because we didn't even know how much further this game would go, if it, how many more aircraft we would actually get. So we just said no, make it firepower 1, and we'll make the ME 109 firepower 1, and then other stuff could be worse than that or better than that, and we'll rate it accordingly.
So I forgot to mention the Spitfire trait on at least the 1 and 2 in the early Spitfires. It is a single trait aircraft with tight turn. And as far as the starter kit goes, that is kind of where you get your first taste of how the aircraft in Blood Red Skies sort of get their own personality or their own unique flight characteristics, right? So the tight turn trait of the Spitfire, comparing it to the very similar stats, but the great dive and great climb of the 109. So what do you think about that, Brett?
Well, sorry.
It's I think stat wise, clearly they're very comparable. I think it's an excellent pair, right? A match set for the starter set. I think it's an obvious choice. It's got all the historical, background that makes it a perfect combination too. But I think stat wise, you have a very good competitor between the two. And I think what you really do to make these things play is you have to then start diving into the card mechanics of, using the doctrines and all that stuff to complement the tactics you have. Now, the traits that you have. I believe from just what I've seen, like reactions I've heard from people who have played the box set a few times and haven't maybe really fully explored the ways to maximize your traits with the doctrines and those kind of things. I think they find that the great climb card that the 109 has is sort of overpowered, right? Because maybe their impression is they've played a few games and they were frequently not allowed to climb to advantage, and that hampered their game. However, I believe if you play enough of the games, and I know you've mentioned this before, Steve, the tight turn or the Spitfire having a single trait has its own advantages. And, of course, we've talked about this a little bit maybe in previous episodes. One way to sort of kind of negate, if you will, partially neuter the power of the great climb is just do a different pilot action. A lot of times you can make that work to your benefit. So I don't want to belabor it, the whole thing. I still believe they are very well matched. I think that's true. I don't think one is greatly overpowered over the other. I think, we joke all the time that tight turn's the cheater card. I think it is a very powerful trait. I think the fact that it's single trait makes it even perhaps more so. But I wouldn't give up on either one of them. I don't think it's fair to say that one or the other is grossly overpowered to its counterpart. What do you think, Steve?
Yeah, I would agree 100% with that. And I will say what I think it really does well in the starter set is it kind of gives two very different play styles in that box set, right? So the reason that I really like the tight turn card is because that's a card that I can use to do what I want to do, right? Like the tight turn card is not dependent on somebody else doing something for me to use the card. And I tend to like to play that way, where I want to kind of be in control of my abilities and the capabilities of my squadron. Where the Great Climb card, very powerful card, but you are dependent on me doing something before you can use it, right? So it kind of takes that little element of control out of the player's hand. But I think as far as pairing them in the starter set, like you said, they're balanced, and it gives people who play two very different ways to experience Blood Red Skies and kind of decide which direction they want to go with their future purchases and expansions of the game.
Yeah, and I mean, jumping in there was also the thinking at the time that the usage of the great climb and the great dive was something that was harder to master. It was something that you had to think about more how you would use it, whereas tight turn is fairly straightforward, very simple. So again, we were thinking in terms of people coming into the game who, on their first play, probably didn't want to get involved in a two-trait type thing, too many thoughts or decisions. So, you'd give that beginner player potentially the Spitfire, because in that sense, less to think about, because the tight turn is just something that you decide yourself how you're going to use that. So there was that element in there as well to provide one of the aircraft that was probably easier to play from a mechanics perspective than the Messerschmitt.
And I feel like Roger was just hitting me kind of with a whole bunch of really nice political backhands there, huh? So I guess I'm just the simpleton that needed to play that Spitfire.
Nah, it's I mean, there was a time in the original iterations of Blood Red Skies where the card mechanics didn't exist, where the traits were always on. So in some respects, the thing with the fact that you only have one trait versus a two-trait aircraft weren't quite so important, because you weren't sort of worried about, you hadn't got your card set watered down like two of this and two of the other, whereas I can have four, say for instance, tight turn cards or whatever. So, you have to remember this is a very early stage in the development of the game, and so much more has been built on top of that since then. And any assessment you make of the aircraft, I think, is perfectly valid, whether you're looking at it from the point of view of when this starter set first came out, or when you look at it now, when you've got X numbers of other aircraft out there, X numbers of other doctrines and traits, etc. I mean, it's interesting to see how people have, really invested themselves in the game, into the traits, into the doctrines, etc., and how much creative thinking and thought there is out there. And certainly some of the, suggestions that, you hear from people saying, oh, well, you must have designed it for that particular reason, and that's fantastic, and you're thinking, oh, God, I wish we had actually thought of it in that sort of, in that depth, but we hadn't. So sometimes we well, Andy, I should say, some of this stuff looks more thought out than it actually was intended to be in the first place.
So from the Mark I, Mark II Spitfire, we jump down to the Spitfire 5B, or no, actually a couple different Mark V Spitfires. Now the 5B is actually my favorite version, and the difference there is you get a little trade-off. You keep that 7 speed, you lose a maneuverability, so you have a 2 maneuverability, but you gain 1 in the firepower. You keep the tight turn, so single trait tight turn. So you get a 722 aircraft. And I'm curious, Roger, what happened in the development of the Spitfire in real life that changed to, there's 3 different Mark V variants. One has the tropical filters, one is the LF that we'll talk about in a second. But what changed in the real life Spitfire from the 5B to the 5 Trop that changed those stats?
Well, actually, there's a missing link in here, because the next model of Spitfire that would have replaced the ones and twos was going to be the Spitfire 3. And the Spitfire 3 was an altogether, more refined version of the Spitfire 2. It had much better structural integrity, better elements of streamlining. Some of the avionics were that little bit better. It was also going to use the Merlin 20 engine, and would have been, coming into service probably in 1941, probably early 1942. And at that particular point in time, everybody thought, well, Battle of Britain, we've done quite well. Spitfire 1 and Spitfire 2 performed well against the best that the Germans could throw. And then what happened was the BF-109F appeared on the scene, and it appeared at the very end of the Battle of Britain. And at altitude, the F was superior, much superior to the Spitfire, to the Spitfire 2, and the Spitfire 3, of course, was still probably a year away. So, but there was a thought, and the Spitfire and the Merlin 20 engine that was going to be in the Spitfire 3 still required some development and was earmarked for other aircraft as well. So what they thought was, well, let's take a sort of a slightly less sophisticated version of the Merlin 20, and let's just fit it into a Spitfire 2 or a Spitfire 1 and see what performance we get. And that is basically what the Spitfire 5 was. It was just really, although there was many original build Spitfire 5s after the event, but the first Spitfire 5s were basically Spitfire 1s with better engines put into them, purely to counter the threat of the BF-109F. And the Spitfire, the designations, say you see A, B, and C, that really refers to the armament that the aircraft carried. So the A variant was fitted with 8 303s, just the same way that the Spitfire 1s and 2s were. The B, if I get this wrong, someone will correct me. The B variant and the C variant added the Hispano cannons to the mix, because it was determined that after seeing the general sort of ineffectiveness of the 303s against German bombers, which could take that amount of hitting, that we needed to bring cannons in there. So the concept was: is it going to be 2 cannons with a mixed with an MG armament, or was it going to be 4 cannons? So you got the different variants. The A, B, and C referred basically to the more or less to the armament type. And then in the C variant, you got, I think at that point, you got the introduction of what they class as the universal wing, which was cleverly created so that you could basically set it up with multiple armament loadouts, whether it be your 8 machine guns, or it would be 4 cannons, 4 20mm cannons, or it would be 2 20mm cannons and 4 303s. And that was generally and that dictated a type of wing. And that was why those aircraft were particularly, you got the 5A, 5B, and 5C. It was in reference to the sort of the wing configuration. So it was a stopgap, the Spitfire 5. It was never intended to be that next level of development of the Spitfire 1 and 2. It was, oh my God, the 109F is going to cause us real problems. We need a better performing aircraft, and so that's where the Spitfire 5 came from. Not sort of like a nice measured development through Mark 3, Mark 4, Mark 5, Mark 6, whatever. Let's go to let's create the 5, and that's what that was. The tropical element was basically, obviously, Britain was involved in combat abroad, whether it be in the Far East or more of the case in the Western Desert. And dust and sand and grit was one of the worst things that could affect the life of engines. On starting up and take off, the amount of rubbish that got dragged into the engines would ruin the engines. So they needed a sand filter, and that's where you then get to see this filter, what they call the tropicalized Spitfire. It really wasn't tropicalized for the heat or anything like that. It was tropicalized because of the wanted to stop dust and dirt and sand and stuff causing problems with the engines. And that was the Vaux filter, I think they called it originally, which was a bit of a... It was the one thing that probably that spoiled the lines of the Spitfire more than anything else. But it was necessary, and majority of sort of a lot of the late Spitfires 5s had this Vaux filter. Some people didn't mind it, said it had no effect on performance. Some pilots said it was terrible. The Australians sort of like refused to fly with it because they said it caused so much problems in slowing the Spitfire down and reducing its maneuverability. There was then a later version, the Abaca filter, which was a much smaller filter, which became a standardized fit for all Spitfires. So yeah, I've gone on a bit there, sorry.
No, that's all right. That's fascinating. That universal wing you were talking about, I always thought that was just such a great feat of engineering, right? Where you kind of just make this empty shell and you can put in whatever you want. And that's, I guess you see some of those little round covers over some of the ports and stuff like that. Is that what those are when you see them sitting in museums sometimes?
Yeah, it's just basically, in a lot of cases, although 420mm cannon could be carried, and I think some of the Spitfire 5s that flew over Malta were in that configuration, it was generally felt that the weight of those 420mm was also something that actually reduced the performance. So the one cannon in each wing and 2 machine guns in each wing became the sort of became the sweet spot for the Spitfire 5. And yeah, you see that you see the long barrel of the gun, and then you see that sort of stub next to it, and that stub was just basically an aerodynamic cover to put over the cannon ports, the third and the fourth cannon ports.
So these are all low 30s points planes, 31 and 32, and we still move to the Spitfire 5 LF. That's also a 32-point aircraft, but the traits change on this one. So this goes from that single tight turn to a great dive, multi-trait of great dive and rapid roll. So it keeps the 722 as the 5, but what happens there with the LF that we get that great dive and rapid roll? Was there an engine change, some type of aerodynamic change? What happened in there?
Well, here we go again. This is it's again more in a reaction to the arrival of an opponent, and in this particular case, the Focke-Wulf 190, which was extremely fast, very nippy at lowish altitudes, and had a very good roll rate. So not only could it sort of snap onto your tail quite quickly, it was also extremely good at evading. If it could get out of trouble by simply just rolling, changing direction, and going in front. So this was a reaction to the Focke-Wulf, and the Focke-Wulf basically just tore its way through the Spitfires to the extent where the sort of the penetration raids that the RAF were doing, which was basically flying, interdiction missions over France, were basically almost brought to a halt simply because the attrition rate was so high from what the Focke-Wulf 190 was doing. At altitude, the Spitfire could still sort of hold its own, but lower down, it couldn't. So what happened was, basically, what they wanted to do was increase its speed and capability at lower altitudes. So this was where they clipped the wings of the standard, took X number of inches off each wingtip, and then just gave that straight edge. And what that did was that also increased the roll rate, which meant that it could better evade a 109 that was on its tail, or get onto a 109. And also there was an appreciable, not great, but a slight increase in speed at low altitude. So it was really, as much as anything, a reaction to an opposing aircraft. Now, from Blood Red Skies, the LF to me, it opens a huge can of worms, and this all comes down basically to sort of rapid roll. Rapid roll as a game trait is really just, I'd class it as a sort of like a slightly substandard version of tight turn. And it's a maneuver thing, so it allows your aircraft to basically, turn tighter than those aircraft that don't have that particular trait. And if you have to look at the Focke-Wulf 190, the Focke-Wulf 190 has rapid roll. It was always, from a historical and technical perspective, everybody says, yeah, fantastic roll rate. The FW190 could outroll anything else that it was generally going up against. And then you got this thing where rapid roll then got translated, was actually a maneuver thing. And if you really look at it, the 190 was a great aircraft, but it wasn't a particularly good maneuverable or turning circle aircraft. But we sort of saddled it with that by giving it rapid roll, because everybody said, oh yeah, a 190 can rapid roll. And there was this sort of, it became a little bit fuzzy. So I think there's still some debates on the rapid roll on the Focke-Wulf 190, but that's what it is at the moment. That's what we have it. So if you then are looking at an aeroplane that was designed to emulate the 190, that you took the wingtips off to give it that rapid roll, it sort of became logical that you would also give it the rapid roll at the same time. Myself, I would have said it probably should have still kept a tight turn, because cutting the wingtips down like that did not really affect the manoeuvrability. It could still turn as tight as other variants of the 5. And the great dive, again, was saying because there is, per se no altitude, performance differences in the traits of it, aircraft. You could say, well, because some aircraft were absolutely phenomenal at low altitude, but absolutely dogs at higher altitude because of lack of superchargers or things like that, and vice versa. You could be king at 25,000 feet, but you were rubbish at 10. We don't really have that in Blood Red Skies. So great dive. So that ability of being able to use the dive increase of speeds, etc. Go faster in the dive was just sort of a way of saying, well, how do we represent the fact that the aim of the clipping of the wings here was to make it go faster at low altitude. So that was the thinking behind it. I would say of all the Spitfire variants and stuff that we've got in here, the LF version is the one that probably we will continue to go back to. We will continue to think about and say, is there a better way of representing this? And that means looking at rapid roll as well, which then probably means looking at FW190s as well. But I think that's a can of worms we don't really want to open up until maybe we're talking about version 2 of the game.
Excellent. So from the 5, we get to the first real distinctly different Spitfire, and I feel like this is where the Spitfire camp kind of goes two ways. We have the Spitfire 9. It's an 822 aircraft, so you get the 8 speed, you get a bump up in speed, you keep the 2 maneuverability and the 2 firepower. It's more expensive, so it comes in at that 37 point mark, and the traits goes to, from here on out, it's pretty much a 2 trait aircraft, right? So you keep the tight turn, but you get that great climb. So I'm assuming that the Mark 9 Spitfire, there was some drastic difference in the evolution of the airplane at that point.
It was well. Again, it was an interim. It was an emergency change as much as anything. Whereas you see things like Spitfire 5 LF was an attempt to quickly fix the Spitfire 5 as it stood to better handle things like the Focke-Wulf. Again, the same thing was happening. In the background, there were the Spitfire 6, the Spitfire 7, the Spitfire 8, which were all very good fighters, but again were, a couple of months away or a year away from being fully developed. So you need to then put into play an aeroplane that is that can better handle the 190. And the Spitfire 9, really, when it comes down to it, is really just a Spitfire 5 with a better engine. And that's what that was all about. And the 9 was intended to be a stopgap, but because it was a good aeroplane, and it proved to be a good aeroplane, and it was, and there was lots of developments on it. I mean, I think some very late Spitfire 9s were the first ones where they actually cut down the fuselage to give the bubble canopies. They introduced a number of different, and experimented with a number of changes that then appeared in later Spitfires in the Mark 9. But it gained performance, and one of the performance gains it had was its ability to operate at higher altitudes as well. It was that point in time where the Spitfire there, and then later on the Griffin engine Spitfires, like the 14, became real masters in the climb. So that's what we're representing here in the Spitfire 9. Basically, a sort of an increase. It's really a Spitfire 5 that's got a better engine, so it can go faster. And it also now has that ability for great climb as well, to give you that additional thing. And it was probably as manoeuvrable as the Spitfire 5, but maybe not quite as. So again, you get a little bonus here, because by switching this now to a 2-trait aircraft, you diluted it down. So you might have two tight turns and 2 great climbs, where previously you had, say, like four tight turns. So your manoeuvrability is slightly reduced. So that was the thinking behind that, was to say, well, basically we got in the Mark 9 we got a much more powerful version of the Mark 5. Again, it was seen as an interim. It's just something we say, right, heck, we've got a great airframe. We've now got a better developed version of the Merlin. Let's stick that on and see what happens. And it worked out nice. It worked out well. So that's the rationale between with the 9.
So then the 14 gets pretty pricey at 41 points. You get a 9 speed and a 2 maneuverability, 2 firepower. Keep the 2 traits, the tight turn and the great climb. And is this then the full-on kind of the bubble canopy Spitfire? I know I vaguely remember seeing some images of a Spitfire that looked like it had like 2 propellers on it. Is that the 14, or are we not there yet?
Well, the Spitfire 14, the basic version of the Spitfire 14 looks very similar to the Mark 9. There's differences, slight differences in shapes in some of the in the tail fins and the like, but the main difference was that, whereas I said that that like the 5 was a stopgap, the 9 was a stopgap, and then behind that there was all these other sort of more advanced versions of the Spitfire that oh heck, they're not going to come into service in time, so we'll do a stopgap. Behind this, so you go through the Spitfires, the Spitfire 4, the Spitfire 6, 7s, 8s. You then eventually came up to something called the Spitfire 12, which was finally bringing into service something that actually, was intrinsically getting better and better. And at that time as well, of course, there was a new enhanced version of the Merlin, which was the Rolls-Royce Griffin, with sort of 2-stage superchargers, etc. was just that much better version. And it was the Mark 12, and then onto that the Mark 14 were the first of the Spitfires that actually took advantage of the Griffin engine. And if we could say that the Mark 9 improved in its climbing performance, well, the Spitfire 14, by the time they got to the 14, it was exemplary. That aircraft could almost climb vertically. There was very, very few aircraft beyond the jets that could actually stay with a Spitfire in a climb. You'll get those anecdotal stories, I think, of like a Spitfire 14 and a P-47 that are sort of barreling along in level flight, and because of the weight and the kinetic, the energy of that P-47, they both pull back on their sticks. And for that short space of time, the sheer inertia of the P-47 will, it will get ahead of the Spitfire. But once give it a few seconds, and then the Spitfire would just leave the P-47 behind, because the P-47 couldn't maintain that rate of climb, but the Spitfire could. And you would not really want to be a German fighter engaging with a Spitfire at altitude. It really became a beast in the vertical. Now, again, great climb in blood red skies is probably it represents that ability of being able to turn energy into positional advantage. I.e., you can use your energy to stop somebody else, gaining advantage of getting above you. So that's why, again, we carried on the great climb aspect with this by to reflect the phenomenal vertical performance that the Spitfire could put in there. So, even though they were quite different aircraft from the Mark 9, it was most visible in it was an increase in level speed. That was the real thing. It was that increase in level speed. And we thought, well, what shall we do? Because a lot of them also had a lot of those. As the Spitfires went on as well, you saw by the end of the war we more or less focused on 4 20mm cannons, and the Spitfire and the Spitfire 14 was probably the later versions of that was the one that most exemplified the introduction of those 4 cannons. So we were thinking of putting a heavy hitter on it, but then we looked at it and said, well, yeah, not all of them had the 4 cannons, etc. So still many operated with the 2. So we thought, well, what should we do? Well, we'll just make it an enhanced version of the Mark 9, and that's what we did.
It is something important to remember with Blood Red Skies is a lot of the things, the traits or the advantage states or the boom chits, it's not a direct correlation to something that happens in real life, right? So a lot of it's an abstraction of it. So your neutral, disadvantage, advantage, it's not representing altitude, it's not representing speed, it's kind of representing an entire grouping of things that happen, right? Same with Great Climb. Great Climb isn't necessarily representing that it has a better climb rate than something. It's representing something that gives that plane a reason to be in a better advantage state than other planes it's fighting against. Same with the boom chits. It's an abstraction of a whole bunch of different things, right? So that's kind of something that kind of leads to the really nice simplicity of the game that is Blood Red Skies, but then those traits kind of bring some of that complexity back as well. So Brett's been sitting there quiet for a long time, and now that we've kind of went through the different marks of the Spitfire, let's talk a little bit about the strategy of how these things play. So I think Brett's probably played more games specifically against Spitfires than anybody I could think of. So Brett, what do you find when you're playing against the Spitfires are some things that you like to watch out for?
Well, can I derail us just a little bit, because we just had such a thorough dive into the different marks that there's cards for in game, and something kind of came to me as I'm looking at this list of the different aircraft. I kind of just wanted to touch on that before we maybe get into some real in-game experience. Can we do that first?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Okay, so I'm looking at this family of aircraft, if you will, right? 6 marks that have cards in game, and I kind of compare that to a family of the competitive the German, if you will, the German comparators, right? The family of 6 frontline fighters. If you throw in the 190s, you basically got 6 V6, right, to choose from. Like, and maybe if you're playing a long campaign series of games, you may stumble into playing the various variants as you progress through the time, right? So that's something that struck me. It's like, okay, not only in the starter set do you have a pretty matched and balanced pair to play against. If you look at these as like a family of aircraft that you might then pitch against with the German comparator, I guess it's also a family of 6. But one advantage I see with the Spitfire is that as you progress and you're playing, you could bounce around in these different marks of aircraft, and in the Spitfire family anyway, and explore different play styles and not necessarily pay a significant points penalty by making that jump. Whereas if you compare that to the experience you'll have playing Germans, if you include the 190s, you got 109s and a couple of 190s that make up 6. You could not. I don't see that you have as much varied play style because of the trait. The traits don't change a whole lot, and when you do get maybe some significant trait or trait and stat changes in the aircraft, I feel like it with the German family of aircraft, you pay a steeper penalty in points, right? So just that's a very high, big picture look at the 6 aircraft versus the 6 aircraft. And so that was kind of interesting to me as I saw that. I was like, oh, that gives you, from my view in that respect, sort of some flexibility and kind of finding your favorite aircraft, or even if you're just playing like a long campaign game, you could bounce around with different advance your aircraft, and it's not necessarily as big a penalty potentially for moving up in those aircraft. So my perspective, of course, being from the long campaign game stuff we do, right? Now, I did, though, see one specific aircraft that I really liked. Immediately I saw it, said, dang, that's like I think it's like, we talked about this when we did the 109 Spotlight, right? Everybody talks about historically, the 109F is the, like, probably high watermark for the 109 in design and performance. But I think in game, I think it could be argued that the 109G is sort of more the sweet spot for in-game performance. I see the Mark 9 Spitfire being really sort of the sweet spot for in-game. What do you think? Do you have a favorite? I think you said you like the 5, but...
Yeah, I'm all about the 5. The 5B to me is... and actually, I might try that 5 Trop, save that point.
You really like single trait, too, so we have a little different play style.
I do. I like the single trait, and I like the points. At 31, 32 points, you really... cannot go wrong with an aircraft that's giving you 2 firepower at 31, 32 points.
Well, man, for the same points as the 109G that I love so much, and I feel like, well, I just really enjoy playing it. Whether I'm good at it or not is another discussion. But for the exact same points with the Spit 9, I get a little faster aircraft, which that's never bad. But also I get to preserve my great climb, but gain tight turn. And that's a really attractive combination for maybe somebody like me who likes to play two traits anyway, or is at least accustomed to playing 2 traits. I circle that on my list. Like, man, that 9 is nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think we here have probably, we spend probably more time thinking about the Spitfires than other aircraft. I guess that's just the nature of the fact of, of your own nationality, what you grow up with, your experience and things like that. But I myself, of those, I think I would agree that the Spitfire 5 is nice because of the sort of the variation that you can see there. But the 9 is just about right to me. It's a good aircraft. I think it's worth the additional 5 points worth over the 5.
Man, this is a really good conversation. Hopefully my my little anecdote about the family of aircraft and sort of my little insight there was cogent or whatever. But as I'm looking, I'm like, I'm surprised that the 9 never really caught my attention like it does, because it certainly has the points that I'm used to and the traits that I would like in combination. So there it is. Maybe it's because I've, in my perspective of playing German stuff and already having the models, that's kept me from like getting something new to bring to a tournament. But maybe from a tournament standpoint, I should consider bringing a 9 to another game.
It's certainly a classic. It's a classic aircraft. I mean, it's I think it is. It's certainly the mount of Johnny Johnson, who's sort of the highest scoring British ace. It's and many of the preserved aircraft that you see flying now are of that later ilk of the the Spitfire 9s or Spitfire 14s or whatever. So it is a pretty aircraft. It's a lovely aircraft.
Brett, I'd really like to know what you do to sort of mitigate that tight turn that is very different play style than anything any of the German aircraft have.
Oh, well, I think one of the things that the first thing that comes to mind is just having an aircraft that has at least 2 firepower, right? Because there's been so many times where, just one's not getting it done. And then you combine that with your ability to do defensive tactics a lot of times. That's probably the single most frustrating thing I encounter, would be doing all the hard work to get the perfect tailing shot or, whatever it is, a great shot. And then you're able to do defensive tactics and turn the odds of me, getting a boom chit to practically nil, right? That's often frustrating, and it's probably the hardest thing I encounter in playing Spitfires. I think that's the first thing that comes to my mind. That's the toughest. That's the biggest like kick in the pants is when I get the job done and I have to fly away without making anything happen because you were able to turn it into a deflection shot for me.
Yeah, especially when you start talking about combining those doctrines and traits and all that stuff in there, you really start to change the way some of those aircraft play against each other. But man,
I feel too, I think in my play style against Spitfire specifically, and this is probably, I would guess that this is probably helpful in just about any scenario. I think I have to set up my play style so that I have a whole lot of aircraft that can at one time take advantage of one aircraft getting put into a state of disadvantage. So there's a lot of opportunities to try to rack up that boom chit within the idea that I'll fly away and come back towards the battle sphere to try again, right? So it's, maybe that's that whole boom and zoom kind of thing, but I'm really trying to do that. And to make that happen, I mentioned, having things that affect my firepower, either just starting with an aircraft that's firepower 2 or having other things that maybe give me some extra firepower, but then having a lot of aircraft that can take advantage of that one dude that's down, but then immediately being able to get the heck out of Dodge, get far away so we can come back around in at a place of our choosing. So that also requires a little bit more speed than E gives you. So, with an E and great dive, I'm thinking of not a great advantage, but once you start getting up to the F, it really feels like an upgrade for me in my gameplay, because that extra inch combined with great dive, now I can kind of affect that where, I take my shots and then I got to get away so I can come back around and fight my fight. That's big picture, but those are the things that come to mind when I'm thinking about fighting Spitfires, and it probably affects how I play most every game now, really.
So Roger, how do you feel about Spitfire in-game, some of your tactics when you're using the Spitfire?
Well, yeah, I tend to try and play using the Spitfire a lot, because I guess I do recognise one, I guess is a bit lazy, because the simplicity of I'm only thinking in terms of tight turns. Yet when I get to a 9, of course, I then have that, which can upset a few people, that great climb ability, which then, can start pinning down people, things that they, I'm trying to say, there's that additional element that, you can stop those people climbing to advantage around you. I think, I'm probably just as guilty as anybody of an overuse of some of the doctrine stuff as well. So the aggressive tactics, defensive tactics, etc., which is extremely powerful. But I tend to find when I play against them, it's as you say, you have to try and swamp them more than anything. You have to, because again they've got that ability to point in so many different directions. It's very hard and very unpredictable as to exactly when you're going up against one of these Spitfires, especially one that's just got the single tight turn trait. It's just a question of just thinking ahead and saying, well, there's a number of axes I've got to cover here, and as Brett says, also boost up that firepower. Because when you get that chance to hit Spitfire, you really need to hit it. So yeah, that's what I would say. You need to swarm them a little bit. Against them, you need to swarm them a little bit. You need to enhance your firepower, I think. Playing them, they're just so easy to play. That's all I can really say. You just have a lot of options with those tight turns. You can get yourself. You can get yourself into so many excellent firing positions using the defensive tactics. You can get yourself out of jail so many times. I'm probably not being as cohesive here about as I could be, but I love playing the Spitfires. They are my favourite. There's no doubts about it, and I try and avoid playing against them if at all possible.
In game, there's no way you can separate the Spitfire from tight turn.
No.
I think in game, Spitfire and tight turn are pretty synonymous. It's really, they go hand in hand.
And just that ability to get, well, I think Yeah, to exploit that turn to get so many, relatively speaking, so many shots in. So, even if it's just down to those boom chits or whatever. Yeah, the low firepower of the early Spitfires is a bit of a hindrance, but once you get to 2, it's a lot easier.
So we've been going for, about an hour and 20 minutes here, hour and 25 minutes. Any closing shots, Roger, just to kind of wrap it up here about the Spitfire? Any last little nuggets of information or any what we could expect to come in the game for the Spitfire or anything like that?
Well, I think we will probably two things that we need to look at. I think is probably the Spitfire 5 LF. We need to sort of look at this whole rapid roll aspect to it, and it's a question of watch this space. We may change it, but we can't change it without changing the Focke-Wulf 190 really. We've had some interesting debates on the tropical version, because theoretically you should represent a tropical 5 with perhaps using the tropical filters card, but that's the drop in speed there was that is reflected by a card is a great deal more than the actual loss of speed, which is only about less than 10 miles per hour in reality for the Spitfire. So I'm thinking that we may, the tropical was put in there probably because we've got some very nice models for some reason out there of the tropical Spitfire. So we put those stats in there. I'd like to see us look at some of the other ones, the Spitfire, which people don't really tend to focus on, which is the sort of Spitfire 7s and 8s and stuff, which were used mostly overseas. So I'd like to see us do some stuff on those. They're not going to be that radically different, but hopefully we could put something in there to make them just make that little bit difference and show that there is another family. It's the same thing with anything related to the Far East, from a British perspective. The Forgotten Army and all that sort of stuff. People talk about Spitfire 9s and 5s and that, but that whole other grouping of Spitfires, the Mark 8s, etc. Just don't get mentioned at all, and I'd like to see us put something in there for that.
So how about you, Brett? Any last words here before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I know we kind of ran out of time to get in great detail about any of this, but in game, are there many ace cards for the Spitfire?
Yeah, I'll turn that over to Roger. I'm not an ace heavy guy like some of these players are out there. I'm not super familiar with the aces on the Spitfire.
Yeah, I mean we just have. Let's see, we have. I mean, originally Johnny Johnson was originally going to be in the Battle of Britain one, but we chopped him out early because we realised that although he ended up as sort of a high scoring British ace, and he did get kills during the Battle of Britain, we didn't. We thought we needed somebody else, so that's hence why we put Sailor Milan in there. I'm desperately trying to remember what the traits are of those two particular guys. We certainly need probably some more aces in there because Spitfire did produce a fair number of them. I'm just trying to think. What Sailor Milan, Set Them Up, Killer Instinct. That's a nice one for groups. I like the Set Them Up ace skill. Johnny Johnson, Blackout Master, Mother Hen. Again, yeah, the British ones we tend to be one of those that sort of show pilots that are really sort of like team players rather than individuals, which I think was sort of the thing of the way the RAF worked. But there'll certainly be room to bring in more. Bring in more, and we probably need somebody like a Spitfire 14 ace or something like that to just give us that little bit of difference.
I think LPP made an LPP card, unofficial card for. Gosh, forgive me, I can't remember the name, and I don't have any of that stuff in front of me. But it was a recce pilot who flew a Spitfire, among other things, that I think we might have done a card for. I can't recall, but folks who are really interested enough, if you're out there still listening, maybe check out the site and see our card list. There might be one in there that is a Spitfire guy, but it's anything with the Spitfire, RAF in general is way outside of my wheelhouse. So I appreciate you guys having me on and let me learn from you.
Yeah, I mean that was excellent, Roger. I just like I said, I know like basically the Americanized version of the plane, right? Which is like the elliptical wing and kind of the maneuverable aircraft and this like plane with beautiful lines type deal. But just learning more about the substance of it. I know it's late over there for you. Really appreciate you having you on. And man, I hope the listeners enjoyed it also. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Roger.
Excellent. And if you guys listening enjoy these aircraft spotlight episodes, definitely drop us a line. Let us know if there's an aircraft that you'd like to hear about, or maybe you're kind of a self-taught expert on one as well that you could come on, teach us a little bit about the strategy, how that compares with the real-life aircraft. And we look forward to seeing you guys next time. Thanks a lot.